The sound of chains scraping against asphalt echoed through our quiet suburban street as my F-150 disappeared onto the back of a tow truck at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. My neighbors peered through their blinds like some reality TV drama was unfolding in their front yards. And standing there in her pristine white bathrobe, arms crossed with that smug smile I'd grown to despise, was Linda Morrison, our HOA president and the architect of what would become the most expensive mistake of her life. 3 months earlier, I'd moved into 1247 Maple Ridge Drive with nothing but hope, my savings, and a dream of finally owning a piece of the American suburbs. The house was perfect, a modest 2-story colonial with a decent-sized driveway and a garage that had seen better days. What I didn't know was that I'd just entered the kingdom of Linda Morrison, a woman who treated HOA bylaws like gospel and viewed any deviation from her vision as a personal insult. Linda was one of those people who'd clearly peaked in high school student government and never quite moved on. She was in her mid-50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair that defied both gravity and humidity, and the kind of aggressive tan that screamed, "I have opinions about your landscaping choices." She drove a gleaming silver Mercedes C-Class that she parked at an exact 45-degree angle in her driveway every single day, as if her car was on display at a dealership. Our first interaction came during my second week in the neighborhood. I was unloading lumber from my truck bed, nothing fancy, just some 2x4s for a small deck project, when I heard the sharp click-clack of heels on concrete approaching from behind. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying that particular pitch that somehow managed to sound both sweet and condescending at the same time. "I'm Linda Morrison, HOA president. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." I turned around, wiping sawdust from my hands on my jeans. "Hey there, I'm Jake. Just moved in a couple weeks ago." Her eyes immediately zeroed in on my truck, a 2018 Ford F-150 in what I'd call working man blue, with a few dings and scratches that told the story of honest work. It wasn't pristine, but it was reliable, paid for, and it was mine. "That's quite a substantial vehicle you have there," she said, circling it like a shark sizing up wounded prey. "I hope you're planning to park it in the garage?" "Actually, my garage is full of boxes right now. Still unpacking, but the driveway works fine." The temperature in her smile dropped about 20 degrees. "Well, you'll want to review Section 4.3 of our community guidelines. We have very specific standards about vehicle presentation and parking arrangements. Commercial vehicles, oversized trucks, and anything that might impact property values needs to be properly stored." "It's just a regular pickup truck," I said, keeping my voice level. "Half the guys on this street probably have similar vehicles." "Perhaps," she said, pulling out her phone and taking a picture of my license plate. "But they're not new residents, still in their probationary period." And there it was, the first shot, fired in what would become a 3-month siege. But I had no idea she was already planning something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about suburban warfare. Over the next few weeks, Linda Morrison turned harassment into an art form. It started small, official HOA notices slipped under my door about minor infractions that needed immediate attention. My grass was apparently 3/4 of an inch too tall. My mailbox needed refreshing because the black paint had a small chip. My outdoor trash cans were visible from the street for approximately 4 hours longer than allowed on pickup day. Each violation came with increasingly formal language and thinly veiled threats about community standards and property value preservation. But it was the truck that really got under her skin. Every morning, I'd find a new orange violation sticker plastered to my windshield like some kind of suburban scarlet letter. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October. I was in my garage, finally getting around to organizing the space, when I heard voices outside. Through the window, I could see Linda standing in my driveway with two other women I recognized as her HOA cronies, Margaret Chen from the corner house, and some blonde, whose name I never caught but who always looked like she'd stepped out of a country club catalog. "You see what I mean?" Linda was saying, gesturing toward my truck with obvious disgust. "It's completely inappropriate for a neighborhood of this caliber. The rust alone is probably bringing down everyone's property values." I looked at my truck. There was a tiny spot of surface rust on the tailgate where a shopping cart had dinged it months ago. "We're talking maybe the size of a quarter. And look at this," she continued, running her finger along the truck bed. "Work equipment, tools scattered around. This isn't a construction site." My toolbox was locked, organized, and cleaner than most people's kitchen counters, but facts had never been Linda's strong suit. I stepped outside, and all three women turned toward me with the practiced coordination of a synchronized swimming team. "Ladies," I said with a nod, "everything okay out here?" Linda's smile could have frozen antifreeze. "Oh, Jake, we were just conducting our monthly neighborhood assessment, making sure everyone's maintaining the standards we've all agreed to uphold." "Standards," I repeated. "Right. And my truck is failing to meet those standards, how exactly?" "Well," Margaret chimed in, consulting a clipboard like she was conducting official business, "there's the size issue, the commercial appearance, the visible wear, and deterioration." "It's a 3-year-old pickup truck with 40,000 miles on it," I interrupted. "I use it to haul groceries and the occasional piece of furniture." "What exactly makes it commercial?" Linda stepped forward, and I could smell her perfume, something expensive and overwhelming that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. "Jake, I understand you might not be familiar with how communities like this operate. We maintain certain standards, certain expectations, and vehicles like yours, well, they send a message about the kind of neighborhood this is." "And what message is that?" I asked. "That we're a working-class area," she said, as if the words tasted bitter in her mouth. "That we're not serious about maintaining property values. That we don't care about appearances." I felt my jaw clench. God forbid anyone think working people live here. The blonde, whose name I didn't know, gasped audibly, as if I'd just announced my intention to sacrifice goats in the front yard. "There's no need to be defensive," Linda said, her voice taking on that fake patient tone people use when they're explaining something to a child. "We're simply asking you to consider the community. Perhaps park it in the garage. Or better yet, maybe consider something more. Appropriate for the neighborhood? Like your Mercedes?" I asked. Her smile turned sharp. "My Mercedes is a luxury vehicle that enhances the community's image. Surely you can see the difference." I could see the difference, all right. The difference between someone who judged people by their possessions and someone who actually worked for a living. "I'll take that under advisement," I said, which was polite speak for go to hell. Linda's eyes narrowed. "I do hope you will. Because the next step in our enforcement process is significantly less friendly." As they walked away, heels clicking in perfect rhythm like some kind of suburban death march, I had no idea that Linda Morrison had just declared war. But what I really didn't know was that she'd already started researching every legal loophole she could find to make my life miserable. November brought the first real cold snap, and with it, Linda Morrison's next level of psychological warfare. I woke up on a Monday morning to find a brand new sign planted in the grass strip between my driveway and the street. NOVERVEIRNIGVEICLSINVAI. The thing was positioned with military precision so that it would apply specifically to anyone parking in my driveway. My neighbors' driveways? Clear sightlines, no signage issues. But mine apparently sat just close enough to some invisible property line to justify Linda's latest power play. I called the city planning office that afternoon during my lunch break. "Sir," the bored-sounding clerk explained, "HOA regulations supersede city parking ordinances in designated communities. If your association has voted to restrict overnight parking in certain areas, that's between you and your HOA board." "And when exactly did this vote happen?" I asked. "You'd have to check with your HOA president about meeting minutes and voting records." Of course I would. That evening, I knocked on Linda's front door. She answered, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, holding a wine glass filled with something that looked expensive and red. "Jake," she said with fake surprise, as if she hadn't been watching me through her window. "What brings you by this lovely evening?" "The sign," I said simply. "Oh, that." "Yes. Well, several residents expressed concerns about overnight parking affecting sightlines and traffic flow. The board voted to address the issue." "What board meeting?" "I never got a notice." Her smile could have cut glass. "Oh, it was an emergency session. Very last minute. But I'm sure you understand when safety issues arise, we have to act quickly." "Safety issues," I repeated. "Absolutely. Large vehicles parked overnight can create blind spots for other residents backing out of their driveways. Children playing in the street. You understand." I looked over at her Mercedes, parked at its usual perfect angle in her driveway. "And your car doesn't create any sightline issues?" "My vehicle is appropriately sized and positioned," she said, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "But I appreciate your concern for community safety." The conversation was going nowhere, and we both knew it. This wasn't about safety or sightlines or community standards. This was about Linda Morrison establishing dominance, and my truck had become the hill she'd chosen to die on. "When's the next official board meeting?" I asked. "Third Thursday of every month. 7 p.m. at the community center. Though I should mention, new residents typically observe for the first year before participating in discussions. It helps you understand how things work around here." "I'll be there," I said. "Wonderful," she replied, but her tone suggested it would be anything but wonderful for me. As I walked back to my house, I noticed several neighbors peeking through their curtains. Word was spreading through Maple Ridge Drive like wildfire, and sides were being chosen. What I didn't realize was that Linda had spent the afternoon making phone calls, solidifying alliances, and preparing for a much bigger confrontation than I could have imagined. The third Thursday in November was unseasonably cold, with a bitter wind that cut through my jacket as I walked to the Maple Ridge Community Center. The building was one of those generic suburban structures that tried to look welcoming, but mostly succeeded in looking like a cross between a dentist's office and a funeral home. I arrived 10 minutes early, hoping to get a feel for the room and maybe chat with a few neighbors before things got started. Instead, I walked into what was clearly a carefully orchestrated ambush. Linda sat at the head of a folding table like a corporate board meeting, flanked by Margaret Chen and two other HOA board members I'd seen around but never met. About 15 residents were scattered across metal folding chairs, and the energy in the room felt charged with the kind of tension you get when people are about to watch a public execution. "Jake," Linda called out with that same artificial enthusiasm. "So glad you could join us tonight. Everyone, this is Jake Morrison, no relation," she added with a little laugh that wasn't quite as funny as she thought it was. "Our newest resident from 1247 Maple Ridge." I found an empty chair near the back, nodding to a few neighbors who made eye contact. Most didn't. The meeting started with typical HOA business budget discussions, landscaping contractors, plans for holiday decorations, standard suburban bureaucracy that moved at the speed of molasses. but I could feel the anticipation building. This was all foreplay. Everyone knew why they were really here. Finally, Linda shuffled her papers and put on her reading glasses with theatrical precision. "Now, we come to new business," she announced. "Specifically, ongoing violations of community vehicle standards that have become a concern for multiple residents." She looked directly at me. "Jake, would you like to address the board about your parking situation?" The room went quiet enough to hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. This was my chance to make my case to the community. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. "Sure," I said. "I drive a 2018 Ford F-150 that I park in my own driveway. It's clean, well-maintained, and fully legal. I use it for normal transportation and the occasional home improvement project. I'm not sure what violation we're talking about." Linda consulted her notes like a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination. "According to Section 4.3 of our community guidelines, oversized vehicles with commercial appearance are restricted from overnight parking in visible locations." "Commercial appearance?" I asked. "It's a standard pickup truck. Half the contractors, landscapers, and service people in this city drive identical vehicles." "Exactly," said Margaret Chin, speaking up for the first time. "Commercial vehicles. The kind used by contractors and service people." The logic was so circular it made my head spin. So anyone who drives a truck is automatically commercial? "Anyone who drives a truck that size with that level of wear and utilitarian appearance," Linda clarified. "Yes?" I looked around the room. How many people here drive SUVs? Crossovers? Minivans? A few hands went up tentatively. "Those are all bigger than my truck," I continued. "Some of them are significantly bigger." "Are those commercial vehicles too?" "Those are family vehicles," Linda said patiently, as if explaining basic math to a toddler. "They're designed for suburban family use, not work purposes." "And how exactly do you determine what I use my truck for?" "Well," she said, consulting her notes again, "there have been reports of work equipment visible in the truck bed. Tools, lumber, construction materials." "You mean the toolbox I keep locked in the back and the lumber I bought at Home Depot for a deck repair?" "Commercial activity," Margaret chimed in. "Running a business from a residential property." "I'm not running a business. I bought some lumber to fix my deck. That's called home ownership." But I was starting to realize this wasn't a rational discussion. This was a show trial, and the verdict had been decided before I ever walked through the door. Linda stood up, commanding the room's attention with practiced ease. "The fact remains that multiple residents have expressed concerns about the impact on property values. We have a responsibility to protect everyone's investment in this community." "What residents?" I asked. "I'd like to hear from them directly." "Well, I think it's inappropriate to put people on the spot like that," Linda said quickly. "But I can assure you, the concerns are legitimate and widespread." I looked around the room again. Most people were studying their shoes or the ceiling tiles. A few met my eyes with what looked like sympathy, but nobody spoke up. "Here's what I propose," Linda continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone offering a generous compromise. "We give Jake 30 days to find alternative parking arrangements, either garage storage or off-site parking. After that, any vehicles in violation of community standards will be subject to immediate towing." "Towing," I said, "from my own driveway?" "From any location that violates community guidelines," she clarified. "The HOA has legal authority to enforce these standards." The vote was a foregone conclusion. 7 in favor, 2 abstaining, nobody opposed. I was officially on notice. As the meeting broke up and people filed out with the awkward energy of those who just witnessed something uncomfortable, Linda approached me with her most patronizing smile. "Jake, I hope you understand this isn't personal. We're just trying to maintain the community we've all worked so hard to build." "Right," I said. "Nothing personal." But as I walked home through the cold November night, I could feel her watching me from her front window, and I knew with absolute certainty that Linda Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of her well-manicured life. December came with an early snowfall that turned Maple Ridge Drive into a Christmas card postcard. Most of my neighbors had their holiday decorations up. By the first week of the month, tasteful displays of white lights and wreaths that looked like they'd been coordinated by some suburban design committee. My truck, parked in my driveway with a light dusting of snow on the windshield, looked increasingly like an enemy combatant in Linda Morrison's perfect suburban war zone. The final notice arrived on December 15th, delivered not by mail or tucked under my door, but handed to me personally by Linda herself. I was scraping ice off my windshield before heading to work when I heard those familiar heels clicking up my driveway. "Good morning, Jake," she said, her breath forming little puffs in the cold air. She was wearing a long wool coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her makeup was already perfect despite the early hour. "Linda," I said, not looking up from the ice scraper. "I wanted to personally deliver this," she said, holding out an official-looking document in a manila envelope, "just to make sure there are no misunderstandings." I took the envelope and opened it right there in my driveway. Inside was a formal HOA violation notice with legal letterhead and everything. The language was dense and full of whereases and heretofores, but the message was crystal clear. I had 48 hours to move my truck or it would be towed. 48 hours, I said. "I'm sorry it's come to this," Linda said, though she didn't look sorry at all. "But the community has been very patient. Other residents are starting to ask why the rules don't apply equally to everyone." "What other residents?" I asked, the same question I'd been asking for months. "Jake," she said, with that fake patient tone I'd grown to hate, "I understand you might feel singled out. But this is about maintaining standards, property values, community cohesion. Surely you can understand that?" I looked up at her, standing there in my driveway like she owned the place, radiating the kind of entitlement that comes from never having been told no in your entire adult life. "I understand perfectly," I said. Something in my tone must have registered because her smile flickered for just a second. But she recovered quickly. "Wonderful. Then we won't have any problems. The towing company has been notified, and they'll be on standby starting Monday morning." She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Jake? I hope there won't be any unpleasantness when they come. These things go so much smoother when people are cooperative." As she click-clacked back down my driveway, I folded the notice and put it in my jacket pocket. What Linda Morrison didn't know was that I'd spent the last month doing some research of my own. And what I'd discovered about her pristine Mercedes and her perfect suburban life was about to turn her world upside down. Tuesday morning, December 17th, dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp winter air that makes everything seem sharper and more vivid. I was up early, not because I was worried about the towing truck, but because I wanted to be ready for what was about to unfold. At 7:15 a.m., I heard the rumble of diesel engines echoing down Maple Ridge Drive. From my kitchen window, I watched a professional towing rig turn the corner, followed by what looked like Linda Morrison's personal escort convoy, her Mercedes, Margaret Chen's silver Lexus, and a black BMW I didn't recognize but assumed belonged to another HO board member. The cavalry had arrived. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto my front porch, still in my robe and slippers, to watch the show. The tow truck driver was a grizzled guy in his 50s, wearing a company jacket and the expression of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. He pulled up behind my F-150 and started the mechanical ballet of chains, hooks, and hydraulics that would remove my truck from the premises. Linda emerged from her Mercedes like a general, surveying a victorious battlefield. She was dressed in what I'd come to think of as her official business outfit, a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and heels that announced her presence with every step. "Good morning, Jake," she called out cheerfully, as if we were neighbors chatting about the weather instead of adversaries in the final act of a 3-month war. "Morning, Linda," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. "Beautiful day for a towing, isn't it?" A small crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle. Mrs. Patterson from across the street stood in her yard, pretending to get her morning paper. The Johnsons were suddenly very interested in their mailbox. Even old Mr. Rodriguez had found urgent landscaping work that required his immediate attention in his front yard. The tow truck driver approached Linda with a clipboard. "You're the HOA president, right? I need a signature authorizing the tow." "Absolutely," Linda said, signing with a flourish. "Thank you so much for being prompt." She looked up at me, standing on my porch, and I could see the triumph in her eyes. This was her moment of victory, the culmination of months of careful planning and strategic harassment. "Jake," she called out, "you have until noon to collect any personal items from the vehicle. After that, it goes to the impound lot." "Thanks for the heads up," I said, raising my coffee mug in a mock toast. The tow truck finished its work with mechanical efficiency, lifting my F-150 onto its back like some kind of suburban trophy. As it rumbled away down Maple Ridge Drive, Linda stood in the middle of the street with her hands on her hips, surveying her kingdom with obvious satisfaction. "Well," she announced to the assembled neighbors, "I think we can all agree that's a significant improvement to the community aesthetic." A few people nodded politely. Most just looked uncomfortable. But what Linda Morrison didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while she'd been orchestrating my public humiliation, I'd been making some phone calls of my own. And the truck that was about to turn the corner onto Maple Ridge Drive was going to change everything at T exactly 7:45 a.m., while Linda was still basking in her victory, and the neighbors were slowly drifting back to their morning routines. A new sound echoed down our quiet street. This wasn't the rumble of a diesel tow truck. This was the throaty growl of a well-tuned diesel engine attached to a much larger, much more expensive piece of equipment. A massive rollback tow truck turned the corner, the kind they use for luxury vehicles and high-end repos. The kind that costs serious money to operate and doesn't show up unless someone is about to lose something valuable. Linda was still standing in her driveway, chatting with Margaret Chen about their successful morning's work, when the truck pulled up and stopped directly in front of her house. I watched from my porch as the driver climbed down from the cab, a woman in her 40s, wearing professional work gear and carrying an official-looking folder. She walked directly to Linda's Mercedes with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Excuse me," Linda called out, her voice carrying that particular pitch that meant trouble was brewing. "What exactly are you doing?" The driver looked up from examining the Mercedes. "Vehicle repossession." "Are you Linda Morrison?" The color drained from Linda's face so fast I thought she might faint right there in her driveway. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice suddenly much smaller than usual. "My car payments are current." "There's no way." "Ma'am," the driver interrupted, holding up the folder, "I have a legal repossession order issued by Prestige Auto Finance. The account for this 2023 Mercedes C-Class is 97 days past due. Total amount owed is $43,847. Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Around the street, neighbors who had been drifting back toward their houses suddenly found renewed interest in the morning's entertainment. But there has to be some error, Linda stammered. "I can call my financial advisor right now and sort this out." "Ma'am, you're welcome to contact whoever you need to contact," but this vehicle is being repossessed today. I need you to remove any personal items and provide the keys." That's when Linda's shock transformed into the kind of rage I'd seen simmering under her polite suburban surface for months. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her carefully modulated voice cracking. "You can't just come into our neighborhood and steal people's cars. This is harassment." "Ma'am," the repo woman said calmly, "this isn't harassment. This is legal repossession due to non-payment. The vehicle needs to be surrendered immediately, or I'll need to call law enforcement." Linda looked around desperately, as if searching for someone to rescue her from this nightmare. Her eyes landed on Margaret Chin, who was backing slowly toward her own car with the expression of someone who suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. "Margaret," Linda called out, "tell her this is insane. You know I would never let my car payments lapse." But Margaret was already climbing into her Lexus, avoiding eye contact like Linda had suddenly developed a contagious disease. That's when Linda's gaze swung up to my porch, where I was still standing with my coffee mug, watching the proceedings with what I'm sure looked like barely contained amusement. "This is you," she screamed, pointing at me with an accusatory finger. "You did this somehow. You're behind this." I took another sip of coffee and shrugged. "I'm just a guy who drives a truck, Linda. How could I possibly affect your car payments?" But the truth was, Linda Morrison was absolutely right. I had done this. Not the repossession itself that was entirely her own financial mismanagement coming home to roost. But I had made a few strategic phone calls to people I knew in the automotive finance industry. I had asked the right questions, pulled a few professional favors, and discovered that Linda's perfect suburban lifestyle was built on a house of cards that was already collapsing. The Mercedes was gone within 20 minutes, loaded onto the rollback truck with the same mechanical efficiency that had claimed my F-150 an hour earlier. But where my truck's departure had felt like a public execution, this felt like justice. As the repo truck disappeared around the corner, Linda stood in her driveway, staring at the empty space where her status symbol used to be. The neighbors were all gone now, suddenly remembering pressing indoor obligations, leaving her alone with the magnitude of her public humiliation. I finished my coffee and started to head back inside, when Linda's voice cut through the morning air. "This isn't over," she called out, her voice shaky with rage and embarrassment. I paused at my front door and looked back at her. "You're right," I said. "It's not." Because what Linda Morrison still didn't know was that losing her Mercedes was just the opening act of the reckoning that was about to unfold. Over the next week, Maple Ridge Drive became the epicenter of the most entertaining suburban drama our quiet neighborhood had ever seen. Word spread through the community grapevine with the speed of a forest fire, and suddenly everyone had opinions about Linda Morrison's spectacular fall from grace. The story, as it emerged through whispered conversations at mailboxes and grocery store encounters, was even more satisfying than I'd hoped. Linda hadn't just missed a few car payments, she'd been systematically overextending herself for months, trying to maintain the lifestyle that justified her position as neighborhood queen bee. The Mercedes payment was just the beginning. Property tax liens, credit card debt, a second mortgage she'd taken out to pay for home renovations that were supposed to increase property values, the whole perfect suburban facade had been financed on borrowed time and borrowed money. My phone call to a friend in automotive finance hadn't created Linda's problems. It had simply accelerated the timeline of consequences she'd been avoiding for months. But the most beautiful part was watching the neighborhood power dynamic shift in real time. Without her pristine Mercedes and her aura of financial superiority, Linda Morrison suddenly discovered that her authority as HOA president was a lot more fragile than she'd realized. The first crack in her armor came at the emergency HOA meeting called for the following Thursday. I showed up 20 minutes early, curious to see how the Queen would handle ruling without her crown. Linda arrived on foot, which was already a devastating blow to her image in a community where walking anywhere was seen as either fitness enthusiasm or financial desperation. She was still dressed in her usual business attire, but something fundamental had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by the brittle desperation of someone trying to pretend everything was normal while their world crumbled around them. "Thank you all for coming," she began, but her voice lacked the commanding presence she had wielded so effortlessly just a week earlier. Margaret Chen was conspicuously absent. Two other board members showed up, but sat further away from Linda than usual, as if her financial troubles might be contagious. "I want to address the rumors that have been circulating," Linda continued. "My personal financial situation has no bearing on my ability to serve this community as HOA president." "Actually, it does," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to look at Tom Henderson from Oak Street, a retired accountant who'd been quietly observing neighborhood politics for years without getting involved. "According to the HOA bylaws," Tom continued, consulting a document he'd printed out, "any board member who faces legal financial action that could impact their judgment or create conflicts of interest can be removed by majority vote." Linda's face went pale. "I don't think that applies in this situation. Vehicle repossession is definitely legal financial action," Tom said matter-of-factly. "And given that you've been making HOA decisions about property values while apparently struggling with your own financial obligations, I'd say there's a clear conflict of interest." The room erupted in murmured conversations. This was unprecedented in Maple Ridge Drive history, and everyone knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. "I motion for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president," Tom announced. "Seconded," came a voice from the middle of the room. Linda tried to maintain control, but parliamentary procedure was working against her. Within 30 minutes, she'd been removed from her position by a vote of 11-3, with 2 abstentions. As the meeting broke up and people filed out, Linda sat alone at the head table, staring at the papers in front of her with the hollow expression of someone whose entire identity had just been democratically dismantled. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But as I walked home through the cold December night, I couldn't help smiling at the poetic justice of it all. The woman who'd spent months lecturing me about community standards and property values had been undone by her own inability to manage the basic financial responsibilities of adult life. The truck that was waiting in my driveway was going to make the victory complete. On Saturday morning, December 21 style, I was up early again, not because I had to be, but because I wanted to savor every moment of what was about to unfold. At 8 a.m. sharp, the same professional towing company that had hauled away my F-150 pulled up to my house. But this time, they were making a delivery instead of a pickup. My truck looked exactly the same as it had 4 days earlier, a little dusty from its stay at the impound lot, but otherwise unchanged. The driver who helped me with the paperwork was the same grizzled guy who'd loaded it up, and he seemed amused by the whole situation. "Don't see many folks getting their vehicles back this fast," he commented, as I signed the release forms. "Usually takes weeks to work through the legal stuff." "Sometimes things work out better than expected," I said, handing him a generous tip. The sound of my truck starting up echoed down Maple Ridge Drive like a resurrection anthem. I could see curtains twitching in windows all along the street as neighbors realized their morning entertainment was back for an encore performance. I pulled out of my driveway and drove slowly down the street, taking a victorious lap around the neighborhood before parking back in my usual spot, the same location that had caused so much drama and controversy just a week earlier. As I climbed out of the cab, I noticed Linda Morrison standing at her front window, watching through the blinds with the expression of someone witnessing their worst nightmare come to life. She'd been walking or catching rides for 4 days now, and seeing my truck return to its position of honor in my driveway must have been like salt in an open wound. I waved cheerfully in her direction, though I couldn't be sure she saw me through the blinds. The beautiful irony of the whole situation wasn't lost on anyone in the neighborhood. Linda Morrison had spent months arguing that my truck was bad for property values, but in the end, it was her own financial mismanagement that had created the real threat to community stability. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in how my neighbors interacted with me. People who had avoided eye contact during the height of Linda's campaign were suddenly friendly again. A few even stopped by to chat when they saw me working in my driveway, making casual comments about how glad they were to see things back to normal. Tom Henderson, the retired accountant who'd engineered Linda's removal from the HOA board, knocked on my door on Christmas Eve with a bottle of wine and an interesting proposition. "We're going to need a new HOA president," he said. "Someone with common sense and a thick skin. Someone who understands that neighborhoods are for people, not perfect magazine photos." I thanked him for the offer, but politely declined. I'd had enough of suburban politics to last a lifetime. But I did volunteer to help whoever took the position establish some reasonable, adult-oriented community guidelines that focused on actual problems instead of manufactured drama. Linda Morrison